They kept him alive for 20 minutes. 20 agonizing minutes while they systematically tore his body apart, piece by piece, organ by organ, in front of 10,000 screaming spectators who cheered with every slice of the executioner's blade. This wasn't just an execution. This was the most calculated act, human destruction, ever documented in medieval history. And the man they destroyed so slowly, so methodically, so completely was William Wallace, the Scottish hero whose real death makes every Hollywood movie look like a children's fairy tale. What you're about to discover will shatter everything you thought you knew about medieval justice. Because on August 23rd, 1305, in London Smithfield, the English crown didn't just kill a man, they engineered a systematic annihilation of human dignity that was so brutal, so scientifically precise in its cruelty. But even hardened executioners were reportedly sickened by what they were ordered to do. And the most terrifying part: every single agonizing detail was carefully documented by eyewitnesses who wanted the world to remember exactly how far human cruelty could go. Modern forensic pathologists who have studied the historical accounts of Wallace's execution describe it as one of the most medically sophisticated torture methods ever devised. This wasn't random brutality. It was surgical precision designed to maximize suffering while preventing death for as long as humanly possible. The entire process was engineered around one horrifying principle: keep the victim conscious and aware throughout their own systematic destruction. The method chosen for Wallace, hanging, drawing, and quartering, wasn't just an execution technique, it was a masterclass in applied anatomy and pain physiology that medieval executioners had perfected over centuries. Each stage was calculated to cause maximum agony while avoiding the merciful release of unconsciousness or death. When modern trauma surgeons analyze the historical accounts, they estimate that Wallace remained fully aware and experiencing pain for approximately 20 to 25 minutes during his execution, an eternity of conscious torture that defies human comprehension. But before we delve into the systematic horror of Wallace's final moments, you need to understand the man they destroyed and why his death became the most documented execution in medieval history. Because Wallace's torture wasn't just about killing a rebel. It was about creating a spectacle so terrifying that it would haunt Scotland for generations and serve as the ultimate warning to anyone who dared challenge English authority. William Wallace wasn't born to be a hero. He was forged into one by tragedy, betrayal, and a burning desire for justice that would ultimately cost him everything. Born around 1270 to a minor Scottish noble family in Renfrewshire, Wallace grew up in a Scotland that was being slowly strangled by English occupation. His father and elder brother had both died fighting English forces, leaving young William with a legacy of resistance and a thirst for vengeance that would define the rest of his life. When Wallace raised his sword at the Battle of Stirling Bridge in 1297, he wasn't just fighting English soldiers. He was fighting for a vision of Scottish independence that seemed impossible to everyone except him. His stunning victory there proved that English heavy cavalry could be defeated, that Scottish freedom wasn't just a dream, and that a minor landowner with tactical genius could humiliate the most powerful military force in Europe. But King Edward I, known as Longshanks, the Hammer of the Scots, wasn't a ruler who tolerated humiliation. This was the man who had crushed Welsh resistance so completely that Wales wouldn't see independence for 7 centuries. He had expelled every Jew from England, conquered most of Scotland, and earned a reputation for ruthlessness that made hardened medieval warriors tremble. Wallace's victory at Stirling Bridge wasn't just a military defeat, it was a personal insult that demanded the most extreme response possible. The hunt for William Wallace lasted 8 years. 8 years of Edward pouring vast resources into an intelligence network designed to track down one man. Spies, informants, collaborators, and traitors all worked to tighten the net around Scotland's most wanted rebel. The bounty on Wallace's head was enormous, enough wealth to set a man up for life. Every former ally became a potential enemy, every safe house a possible trap, every moment of rest a dangerous gamble. Edward I understood that Wallace represented something far more dangerous than military threat. He embodied the idea that Scottish independence was possible. As long as Wallace remained free, he served as living proof that English rule could be challenged, that Scottish warriors could defeat English armies, and that resistance was not futile. His very existence undermined the legitimacy of English occupation and inspired others to take up arms against their occupiers. The English intelligence network in Scotland was extensive and sophisticated, involving not just professional spies but ordinary Scots, who had been turned through a combination of bribes, threats and promises of advancement under English rule. Former allies found themselves forced to choose between loyalty to Wallace and survival for their families. The pressure was relentless, systematic, and ultimately effective in isolating Wallace from the support network that had kept him alive for so long. The end came, as it so often does, from within. On August 5th, 1305, near Glasgow, Wallace was betrayed by Sir John Menteith, a Scottish knight who had submitted to English rule and decided that 30 pieces of silver was worth more than Scottish honour. The exact details of Wallace's capture remain debated by historians, but the outcome was devastatingly clear. The man who had become the living symbol of Scottish resistance was now in English hands, and Edward I finally had the opportunity he had been waiting 8 years to seize. Wallace's journey from Scotland to London was itself a form of torture, carefully designed to break his spirit before the final punishment. Bound in chains, guarded by English soldiers, he was paraded through English towns, where crowds gathered to see the infamous Scottish rebel. This was psychological warfare at its most calculated, the systematic transformation of a hero into a spectacle, a leader into a curiosity, a symbol of resistance into a trophy of English power. Contemporary accounts describe Wallace during this journey as maintaining his dignity despite the degradation, his eyes fixed on some distant horizon, as if seeing beyond the immediate horror of his situation. Whether this was defiance, resignation, or simply the psychological armor that warriors develop in the face of inevitable death, witnesses noted that he never begged for mercy or showed the fear that his captors desperately wanted to see. The journey took weeks, with Wallace displayed in town squares and marketplaces throughout northern England. Local officials competed to provide the most elaborate reception for the famous prisoner, understanding that association with his capture could advance their careers in Edward's administration. Wallace was forced to endure the jeers of crowds who saw him not as a freedom fighter, but as a criminal who had dared challenge their king's rightful authority. When Wallace finally arrived in London, the city had been preparing for weeks to witness what would become the most elaborate execution spectacle in English history. Edward I had spared no expense in planning Wallace's death. This wasn't just to be justice, but entertainment, education, and warning all rolled into one terrifying package that would be remembered for centuries. On August 23, 1305, William Wallace was dragged before a court at Westminster Hall for what the English called a trial, but what history recognizes as one of the most cynical legal farces ever conducted. The proceedings were held in Latin, a language Wallace likely didn't understand, and presided over by judges who had already decided his fate before he entered the room. The charges against Wallace were carefully crafted to justify the extreme brutality of his predetermined punishment. He was accused of treason against King Edward I, despite the obvious fact that he had never acknowledged Edward as his sovereign. He was charged with murder for killing English soldiers in battle, as if warfare itself was a crime when conducted by Scots against their occupiers. He was accused of sacrilege for attacking English clergy, men who had served as instruments of political control rather than spiritual guidance. When given the opportunity to speak in his own defense, Wallace delivered words that have echoed through history. "I cannot be guilty of treason against Edward I, for I was never his subject. I could not be false to a king. I have never obeyed." This defiant response sealed his fate, though in truth, the outcome had been predetermined from the moment of his capture. The English legal system had become a weapon of state terror, and Wallace was to be its most prominent victim. The sentence was pronounced with ceremonial gravity, each word carefully chosen to maximize the psychological impact on both Wallace and any Scottish observers who might carry news back to their homeland. Wallace was to be drawn through the streets of London tied to a horse's tail, hanged by the neck, but not until death, disemboweled, while still alive with his entrails burned before his eyes, beheaded, and his body cut into 4 quarters for distribution throughout Scotland as monuments to English power. The legal proceedings were designed as theatre, complete with scripted responses and predetermined outcomes that would provide justification for what was essentially a predetermined torture session. The judges, all appointed by Edward I, had no intention of showing mercy to the man who had become the symbol of Scottish resistance. The trial served to legitimise what was essentially state-sponsored terrorism, providing a veneer of legal process to what was actually calculated brutality. The morning of August 23rd dawned clear and warm in London, perfect weather for what the English authorities had transformed into a public holiday. Vendors had set up stalls selling food and ale to the estimated 10,000 spectators who had gathered from across England to witness the death of the Scottish rebel. This wasn't just about justice. It was entertainment designed to reinforce the power of the English crown and the futility of resistance. Wallace was first stripped naked and bound to a wooden hurdle, a crude sledge designed to maximise humiliation and physical suffering. The route from the Tower of London to Smithfield had been carefully planned to ensure maximum exposure and degradation. As he was dragged behind horses through London's busiest streets, the cobblestones tore at his flesh, leaving a bloody trail that marked his final journey. The crowds that lined the route were encouraged by authorities to jeer, throw refuse, and participate in his humiliation. The procession moved slowly through London's narrow medieval streets, allowing maximum time for crowds to gather and for Wallace's suffering to be prolonged. Contemporary accounts describe the route as carefully planned to pass through the city's most populous districts, ensuring that as many people as possible would witness his degradation. The symbolism was deliberate. This was the path that all enemies of English rule would eventually travel. At Smithfield, London's traditional execution ground, a scaffold had been erected specifically for Wallace's death, complete with all the implements necessary for hanging, drawing, and quartering. The crowd here was even larger and more boisterous, with the best viewing positions claimed hours earlier by spectators who had paid premium prices to witness the spectacle up close. The carnival atmosphere was deliberately orchestrated. The English wanted Wallace's death to be remembered not as martyrdom, but as celebration. The executioner who would perform Wallace's dismemberment was a professional who had likely conducted dozens of such killings. His skill lay not just in causing maximum pain, but in keeping the victim alive and conscious for as long as possible. Death was to be the final release, not the culmination of suffering, and every technique was designed to postpone that mercy for as long as humanly possible. Modern medical analysis of the hanging, drawing, and quartering process reveals the sophisticated cruelty involved in each stage. The hanging was performed with a short rope that would cause strangulation rather than the quick death that results from cervical vertebrae dislocation. The victim would be left hanging just long enough to experience the terror of suffocation and the beginning stages of brain oxygen deprivation, but not long enough to lose consciousness completely. Wallace was first hanged by the neck, but the rope was positioned and timed to ensure strangulation rather than the quick death that would result from breaking the cervical vertebrae. The crowd watched as he struggled for breath, his face turning purple, his body convulsing in the universal dance of asphyxiation. Medical experts estimate that he was kept in this state for approximately 3 to 4 minutes, long enough to experience the terror of impending death, but not long enough to lose consciousness completely. The crowd's reaction to this initial torture was carefully documented by contemporary observers. Rather than horror or sympathy, the spectators showed enthusiasm and entertainment, treating Wallace's suffering as a form of public theatre. This reaction had been carefully cultivated by English authorities who wanted to ensure that Wallace's death would be remembered as a celebration of English justice rather than as the martyrdom of a Scottish hero. Just as Wallace began to fade, he was cut down and revived, still alive, still aware of what was happening to him. What followed was the most horrific part of the entire ordeal, a process so brutal that even some contemporary observers were reportedly sickened by what they witnessed. While Wallace was still conscious, still breathing, Still able to see and feel everything that was being done to him, the executioner began the systematic process of disemboweling him. Using a sharp knife, the executioner made a precise incision from just below the ribcage to the pelvis, opening Wallace's abdomen to expose his internal organs. Contemporary accounts describe the crowd falling silent for the first time as they witnessed this ultimate violation of human dignity. The executioner then began removing Wallace's organs one by one, first the intestines, then the stomach, then other internal organs, holding each up for the crowd to see before throwing them into a fire that had been prepared for this specific purpose. The medical precision required for this procedure was extraordinary. The executioner had to have detailed knowledge of human anatomy to know exactly which organs could be removed without causing immediate death, which blood vessels to avoid to prevent fatal hemorrhaging, and how to maintain the victim's consciousness throughout the process. This wasn't random butchery, it was surgical torture performed with scientific precision. The symbolism of burning Wallace's entrails while he watched was not accidental. In medieval thought, the bowels were considered the seat of emotion and compassion. By burning them while he was still alive to witness it, the executioner was symbolically destroying Wallace's humanity, reducing him to something less than human in the eyes of the watching crowd. The smell of burning flesh and organs filled the air, adding another layer of horror to an already nightmarish scene. Through all of this systematic destruction, Wallace remained conscious, his eyes open and aware, his body broken, but his spirit somehow intact. Some eyewitness accounts suggest that he continued to speak, though the exact words have been lost to history. The executioner's skill ensured that he avoided major blood vessels and vital organs that would cause immediate death. This torture was designed to be prolonged, to be witnessed, to be remembered. Contemporary medical understanding was primitive by modern standards, but medieval executioners had developed, through experience and empirical knowledge of human physiology, that allowed them to inflict maximum suffering while maintaining life. They understood which organs could be removed safely, how much blood loss a victim could sustain while remaining conscious, and how to manipulate breathing and circulation to extend the torture for maximum psychological impact. The crowd's behavior during this stage of the execution reveals disturbing aspects of human nature when given official sanction to participate in cruelty, rather than revulsion. Many spectators showed continued enthusiasm, cheering when organs were removed and applauding the executioner's skill. This reaction had been carefully cultivated through years of public executions that had conditioned audiences to view such spectacles as acceptable entertainment. After what contemporary accounts estimate was 15 to 20 minutes of conscious disembowelment, the executioner finally moved to complete his grisly work. Wallace's head was severed with a single stroke of a sharp axe, ending his suffering at last and bringing merciful unconsciousness to a man who had endured more agony than human physiology should have been able to sustain. But even in death, Wallace's humiliation continued according to Edward I's carefully orchestrated plan. The head was held up for the crowd to see, blood still dripping from the severed neck, before being set aside for preservation and public display. The body was then systematically dismembered, cut into 4 quarters, like cuts of meat in a butcher's shop, each piece held up for the crowd's inspection and approval. The disposal of Wallace's remains was as calculated as his execution, designed to send a message throughout Scotland that would outlast his death by generations. His head was dipped in tar to preserve it and mounted on a spike on London Bridge, where it would remain visible for years as a warning to anyone who might consider challenging English authority. The sight of Wallace's decomposing head, picked clean by ravens and bleached by sun and rain, became one of London's most notorious landmarks. The preservation process involved coating the severed head in tar to prevent rapid decay, allowing it to remain recognizable for months or even years. This gruesome trophy was positioned at the entrance to London Bridge, where every traveller entering or leaving the city would be forced to confront the reality of English justice. The psychological impact was carefully calculated. This wasn't just a warning, but a permanent reminder of what happened to those who challenged English authority. The 4 quarters of his body were sent to different Scottish cities, Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling and Perth, where they were displayed publicly as permanent reminders of English power and the fate that awaited rebels. This distribution was more than mere brutality. It was a form of political communication, with each piece serving as a physical message to local populations about the consequences of resistance. Each displayed quarter was positioned in the most prominent location possible, usually the main gate of the city or the central marketplace, where maximum numbers of people would be forced to confront the reality of English dominance. The psychological impact was carefully calculated. These weren't just body parts, but symbols of the complete destruction that awaited anyone who dared challenge English rule. The execution of William Wallace reveals disturbing truths about medieval society and human nature that remain relevant today. The 10,000 spectators who gathered to watch his suffering weren't monsters or psychopaths. They were ordinary people who had been conditioned by their society to view systematic cruelty as acceptable entertainment when it carried official sanction. Contemporary accounts describe the crowd's enthusiasm for the spectacle, their cheers when Wallace's organs were removed, their laughter when his head was displayed. This wasn't just passive observation, but active participation in state-sponsored torture on a massive scale. The normalization of extreme cruelty is perhaps more disturbing than the cruelty itself, suggesting that civilization's constraints are more fragile than we might believe. The English authorities understood that public executions were powerful tools of social control that went far beyond simple deterrence. They were rituals of state power designed to reinforce political hierarchies and social relationships through spectacle and shared participation in violence. Wallace's execution was perhaps the most elaborate such performance of its era, involving not just the physical destruction of the victim, but the psychological conditioning of the audience. The detailed documentation of Wallace's execution suggests that Edward I and his administrators understood they were creating a historical moment that would be remembered for centuries. Every detail was recorded, from the route of the procession to the method of preserving his head, indicating that this was intended to serve English interests for generations beyond Wallace's death. The psychological impact on witnesses extended far beyond the immediate audience. News of Wallace's execution spread rapidly throughout Britain and Europe, creating a reputation for English brutality that would influence international relations for decades. The execution became a symbol not just of English power, but of English cruelty, contributing to the isolation that would later complicate English foreign policy. Edward Longshanks had calculated that Wallace's brutal execution would crush Scottish resistance through sheer terror. The spectacle was designed to demonstrate that challenging English authority would result in consequences so severe that future generations would never dare contemplate rebellion. In the immediate aftermath, this strategy appeared to work perfectly. Many Scottish nobles who had supported Wallace either fled the country or submitted to English rule, calculating that no cause was worth such horrific death. But Edward I had fundamentally misunderstood the Scottish response to martyrdom. Rather than crushing resistance, the extreme brutality of Wallace's execution actually strengthened it by providing Scottish rebels with a powerful symbol of English cruelty and a rallying cry for vengeance that would resonate for decades. The very excess of the execution transformed it from successful deterrent into inspiration for the resistance it was meant to destroy. Robert the Bruce, who would later become King of Scotland and complete the work Wallace had begun, was reportedly moved to action by the spectacle of Wallace's execution. The brutality revealed the true face of English rule and demonstrated that accommodation with Edward I was impossible for any Scot who valued dignity and freedom. Wallace's death had created a culture of no quarter where mercy was neither expected nor given. The manner of Wallace's execution also influenced the tactics of future Scottish resistance. The lesson was unmistakably clear. Capture by the English meant torture and humiliation beyond imagination. This knowledge led to a more desperate and determined form of warfare where Scottish fighters preferred death in battle to surrender, knowing that survival might mean facing Wallace's fate. The transformation of Wallace from failed rebel into martyred hero demonstrates the unpredictable nature of political symbolism. Edward I had intended the execution to serve as the ultimate demonstration of English power and the futility of resistance. Instead, it became a powerful symbol of English cruelty and Scottish courage that would inspire resistance for generations to come. The brutality of Wallace's death became a foundational myth of Scottish nationalism, inspiring countless others to take up arms against English occupation. The very horror that was intended to deter rebellion instead became its greatest motivation, proving that extreme cruelty can sometimes backfire spectacularly when it creates martyrs instead of examples. 7 centuries have passed since William Wallace's execution, but his story continues to resonate because it represents something fundamental about the human condition. The struggle between oppression and freedom. Between those who would break the human spirit and those who would rather die than surrender their dignity. Modern forensic analysis of Wallace's execution reveals the sophisticated cruelty of medieval justice and reminds us that the capacity for systematic brutality exists in every human society when it receives official sanction. The crowds who cheered his dismemberment were not fundamentally different from us. They were products of their time just as we are products of ours, conditioned to accept as normal what we now recognize as horrific. The transformation of Wallace from failed rebel to eternal symbol illustrates the unpredictable power of martyrdom and the way that extreme suffering can transcend its immediate purpose to become something larger than those who inflicted it ever intended. Edward I, he wanted to create a warning, but instead he created a legend that has inspired struggles for freedom across the globe for 700 years. Wallace's execution reminds us that there are principles worth suffering for, causes worth dying for, and that human dignity can be maintained even when everything else is stripped away. His story speaks to our deepest beliefs about justice, freedom, and the indomitable nature of the human spirit when faced with ultimate adversity. The blood-soaked cobblestones of medieval London have long since been paved over, but the echo of Wallace's sacrifice still resonates in every struggle against oppression, every fight for freedom, every moment when ordinary people choose principle over survival. His horrific death serves as both warning and inspiration, a reminder that freedom is never free, and that those who enjoy liberty have inherited it from those who are willing to pay its ultimate price. Today, as we face our own challenges to human dignity and freedom, Wallace's story remains powerfully relevant. The methods of oppression may have evolved, but the fundamental choice between freedom and submission remains the same. His execution reminds us that some things are worth any price, that the human spirit can triumph even in the moment of the body's destruction, and that the greatest victories are sometimes moral rather than military. William Wallace died in agony on that August morning in 1305, but in his suffering he achieved something that Edward Longshanks could never have imagined. He became immortal, transformed by the very brutality intended to destroy him into a symbol of resistance that will endure as long as humans value freedom over security and dignity over survival. The man who was torn apart so methodically, so completely, so publicly, had in his death accomplished what he could never achieve in life. He had become unbreakable,